Alright, I'm Mark with Macroscopic Solutions, and what I'm going to start doing is recording all of the samples that I'm going to be imaging, whether that be for our own internal purposes, whether our clients are sending us materials where they need high-resolution images of them, or if it's to do demos for specific departments within universities. So the idea here is we're going to get a mixture of a large variety of different materials that are going to be typically challenging or difficult to capture images of using regular microscopes or even sophisticated digital imaging solutions. So some of these materials are going to prove challenging even for us, and what I'd like to just do is share our method for imaging these difficult specimens with everyone in a public way so that we can all learn and progress from here. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a photograph of a specimen that's quite dark in color, but also a little bit larger in size. So, what I have here is a bumblebee. What I'll do is I'll post this here and share it with you, just so you have an indication of scale. Okay, so the entire specimen is about 2 centimeters, 2.5 centimeters in length. It's not the darkest specimen we have, but bumblebees typically are quite dark when you're doing a headshot or you're trying to photograph legs or even the wings sometimes. So we're going to work with this specimen, also being that it's a little bit larger. We're going to be working with the MPE 65mm lens, somewhere between a 1 to 3x range. Just to give you a little bit of an overview on the system I'm going to be using. We're using the EOS R mirrorless camera, the MT26EX flash. We have the universal stage here to give us a little bit of flexibility when we're moving and manipulating this specimen. And then we have a light dome, which we place over the rotational stage, which is designed to block any direct light, but also bounce light around internally so that we're getting the specimen well illuminated from all angles. And there's a couple of different ways you can go about doing this. Typically, these flash arms are not something we've ever had, but they do give us a little bit more flexibility when we're working with different types of specimens. So I'm just going to place the top on here, and we're going to power on our controller, which is the Cognisys Stack Shot, and we're going to open up live view so that everyone here can see what it is that we're doing. I'm going to go to its automatic function on the DSLR. The automatic function is going to allow us to see what we're looking at. We'll move the light down a little bit just to give us an idea of where we are. Okay, we also want to bring the specimen down a little bit, so we'll move the entire stage down. And for something like this where we're trying to contrast something that's really dark, what we're going to do, I think, is really just sort of focus on a headshot here. Now, this is a museum specimen. It's been in collections for a long time, so you're going to notice it's not exactly a fresh specimen. There's going to be dust on the specimen, and I'll show everyone how we can go about cleaning that up using Photoshop. Okay, now what we'll do is just get everything nice and centered. So the nice thing about this stage here is it gives me a good deal of flexibility in terms of how I would like to orient, but also while keeping my specimen quite centered. If everything is not quite level, we can also turn to the dial on the lens here on the foot plate. That allows us to rotate in a clockwise or counterclockwise orientation to just make sure that, so what we can do is use kind of the antennae and the tops of the eyes there to just make sure we have our specimen nice and level for a very aesthetic and well-centered shot. Okay, right there. All right, so now it seems like we have everything well positioned. Again, we're going to take our dome here, we're going to mount it back on. Now the way that this dome is designed to function, it's designed to give you a really clear, crisp black background. So the reason why it's hollow back here, if I were to wave my hand you would see it, it's because there's no surface back here for light to touch. So when the flash fires, because it can't contact anything, it's going to just give you something that's really crisp and dark and black in color, if that's the kind of contrast you're looking for. But with dark specimens, a black background sometimes doesn't contrast very well. The more detail that you want to reveal in a dark colored specimen is generally achieved by stepping up the magnification. That's the first thing. If you're zoomed out of the shot for a more contextual body shot, which we can do when this is done, you'll notice that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to contrast against something that's in the background. Now, if you do need contrast, neutral gray is excellent against light colored specimen and dark colored specimens. It's not so white that in the background that it washes out the subject matter on the specimen, and it's not so dark that you have trouble illuminating the material on the specimen against something that's dark. So basically, we just have different colored felts here. This one's a neutral gray, and we have some Velcro around the dome, which we can then add here. But we'll take a couple of different images, one with neutral gray and one with against black. But what I'll do now isn't going to be so different depending on what background you choose. First, let's just set this up, and then I'll give you a little bit of insight into what I'm looking for in terms of light and camera settings when I start to take this image. There's also a lot of depth here. We're just doing a headshot. There's absolutely no reason to move past this point as a starting point. We don't need to go all the way to the end, just sort of a midsection, but we do want to make sure that as we move away from the specimen, our focal plane reaches just outside the foremost part of the specimen. So that's right there. Also, it's important to note that we are at 3x magnification. So what I'm going to do is just take a look at my other desktop here at 3x magnification. These are the ideal camera settings we have figured out for you. But the step size will be 0.08 millimeters. So we're going to go ahead and enter that into our stack shot now. So that means that every time a photograph is taken, it's going to travel 80 microns relative to the next photograph. That's the depth of the area that's in focus. Okay, the next thing we want to do is begin to set up just our settings for how we're going to be taking this image. So for that, we're going to take our camera setting off of automatic, and we're going to go into manual mode. The live view is going to go dark because it's not going to pick up as much light anymore. So we're going to use the quick preview window. We also want to hide any direct light that's coming from another source. Now typically that's not even going to be seen because most of the light is going to be coming from our flash unit, but it's still good to sort of hide that. Now the trick here is to make sure that all of the light is not touching the specimen. So basically we want none of the light that's being emitted from these flash heads to really actually come into contact with the specimen at all. We want to block 100% of it and reflect it off of something that can then soften the light, like these diffusers that we have here on the front of the lens. So the lights are far enough back where they're not contacting the specimen, but they're also giving us a really good vantage point to contacting the front end of the diffuser here to reproject onto our specimen. There's a couple different ways you can attack this. You can also move the flash behind the dome if this were open back here and you were looking for a black background. And you can then take the flash and aim it up towards the inner cusp of the ring, and it will project light back towards the front of the lens and then back onto the sample, and you can still miss the front of the specimen. That's why this whole dome here is deeper on the back side, so that you can actually orient the flashes behind it if needed as well. Okay, so what we're going to be doing, again, f4 is standard f-stop for the MPE 65, ISO around 200. We'll give that a go. 1/200 is your typical exposure, and at 3x, probably around, we don't need huge amount of light. Okay, I've got the flash starting at a 1/32 position, so we're going to go ahead, we're going to fire a test shot. Okay, and I can just tell that light is pretty good without having the specimen in focus. I can tell that there are going to be some areas like the hairs and the head, they're going to be quite dark in color. One way we can just test that, we'll take off the background here for a second in order to get a really dark background. And we can compare how dark this area is down here compared to what it is that we're seeing on the specimen. And typically, if we have some information up here that's lighter in color, like we're actually seeing colors where we have browns and blues, it's a really good sign in comparison with the background, which is going to be jet black. So also, because we are trying to reveal as much detail in the specimen as possible, it's not a bad idea to just make the image a tad bit brighter. So what we're going to do is we're going to beef up the ISO from 200 to 320. And this is because if you were to ever edit this image, it is far easier to sort of edit a slightly overexposed image than it is to edit a slightly underexposed image. So if you feel as if you're not getting enough brightness, or if you think you're just trying to get it perfect from the first shot, definitely start by overexposing in just an incredibly minor way. You can see that by doing that, even down here, there's no areas that are washed out because they're so bright, because they're getting hit with so much light. So that's a really, really good composition and something that I generally look for when I'm shooting something that's dark in color. Okay, so where I always store all of my images is in a folder on my desktop called Active 2D. In this case, I have it on an external hard drive. So we're going to navigate to the active folder where these images are being stored. Bombus Croce, that's the specimen. I'm just going to delete all my test shots now. And we're going to move forward and capture a complete image stack now through this specimen. So I'm going to open this up so you can see it a little bit better. And I'm going to press start on my stack shot controller unit. And we're going to go through and we're going to take 111 images through the head of this specimen. Okay, so that set of images is now being captured. What we're going to do is move forward and stack those individual images, and then we'll show you how to edit the dark areas using Photoshop. So what I always like to do is in my folder here, that way it doesn't stop me from taking more images. I like to just add a 1 behind it, and then I like to add the magnification that I had used to keep track. So we'll add a 1 and then a 3x. I'm going to drag the entire folder over to Zreen Stacker. Remember, we're going to stack from back to front when we're at 1 to 5x, not front to back. In case you're new, one thing that I think is very important for everybody to turn off is make sure brightness is turned off and make sure automatic order is turned off. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll align and stack all of these. Now while that's happening, what I'd like to do is step back the magnification a little bit and get a nice lateral view where we're going to have dark areas and light areas contrasted against a dark background. Okay, so the first headshot image has been captured. What we're going to do is we're going to save the output image. In my case, I'm going to be just saving this as a JPEG. Save it in the same folder containing the individual focus stacks. What I'm also going to do is just power down the flash unit and power off the camera as we're not using it at the moment. Turn off the AC power on the flash and we'll turn off the stack shot. Okay, so then to process the next image, we're going to do File, Close Project. Name this one 2 dash 1x, that was our magnification. Drag, and again, we're going to stack from the back to the front. Okay, so while that's processing, now what we can do is move directly to editing our 3x final image. All right. So this is where a touchscreen monitor comes in really helpful. So you can see, if you were to just sort of step back a little bit and look at the image altogether, you can see it looks like it's slightly overexposed. You can see that the areas in the background are quite bright, perhaps a little too bright and washed. This area looks like it's properly exposed, the part we're actually looking at. But some of the background information, like here's the pin, it looks like it's maybe washing out the areas of interest. Now, there's really easy ways to fix that washed out look. Most notably, the first thing I am always going to do is adjust curves. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give everything that's in the background just a little bit more contrast. So you can see that by dragging in this quadrant down here, you can see that everything again is getting just a bit darker and a bit more washed out. Now conversely, you'll see things get a little bit more washed out if I take the top part of this curve Okay, so now the first thing that I like to do is turn to curves. So we're going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Curves. Now you can see that looking at this histogram, if I were to go to the bottom quadrant and then the top quadrant, as I move this line, certain certain contrast adjustments are going to be made. If I were to move this lower line, you're going to start to down to the lower right-hand side. You're going to start to see things get a little bit more washed out and underexposed. But watch as I go to the top quadrant and I plot a point and I start to drag it up to the upper left. You're going to see details sharpen substantially, because what's happening is we're starting to increase the contrast a little bit just around the edges of the specimen that are in focus. What we can also do, let's say your image was underexposed. Let's say you didn't start with an overexposed exposure. The way that you would fix that is by dragging this one up towards the upper left hand as well. That's going to introduce a little bit more exposure to the overall image. But because we did a good job of overexposing, you can see that a lot of the areas that we're interested in that would typically be black on black, that would be very difficult to resolve, are already showing. So here now we just want to sort of eliminate that washed out appearance. So we got that right with our flash. So we don't need to move this quadrant up too much. What we're really focused on is taking this starting look here where everything just looks a little bit blank and washed, and just sort of beefing up the contrast. You can just see how much more contrast, how much more clarity there is around the details of the specimen just from that one function alone. Okay, now let's focus in on an area. I'm just going to pinch in with my fingers. This is touchscreen, where we do have dark on dark. So we've got all these dark black hairs contrasted right against basically a dark exoskeleton. So what we're going to do is move down to shadows and highlights. And when you have the shadows and highlights window open, it's automatically going to start with an adjustment just to show you what potential you have. Now, this is not the automatic settings. Once it sort of like basically applies default settings, which are these 35%, 50, 30, so forth. It's not at all something you want to keep. Again, you can see how washed out it is. It's a bad image. It even brings in some noise, which didn't exist before. You want to make sure that show more options is turned on. You can see you only have two options if it's turned off. If you turn it on, you have a lot more control here. So what it's essentially doing, the software, is it's assuming that the image is quite dark. So what it's trying to do is take these areas of shadow and it's trying to introduce a little bit more exposure in those areas just to give you a little bit more light. Now, it's okay to go somewhere between 1 and 7%. 35% is massive. The other way that you can, of course, tone this down is, of course, just by adjusting tone. And the other thing is radius. Sometimes if you just increase a much larger radius, what it's doing is it's then taking these hairs, and where it would be basically a really, really fine, sharp adjustment applying to one hair, is it's sort of basically expanding that across a greater amount of pixels. Highlights. Now this is what you want to use, and we're going to be using highlights in the next shot where we have a bit of reflection. You can see that there's a bit of reflection here from the dome, but it's not so much that it interferes with detail. We still can count every hair, every pore, every dust particle that's in that area. But highlights is how you're going to remove glare, principally, and shadows is how you're going to brighten dark images. So this is just really, this is the main catalog window you want to be playing with when you're trying to show dark images. But again, remember, we didn't have a terrible image to start. We exposed this correctly. So while we did brighten this a little bit, if I were to just cancel, you can see we still have these hairs. They're there. They're not as vivid as if we had, actually adjusted the shadows, but they're still here, and it's information that can be observed later on. But for the most part, a standard rule of microscopy is if you're not looking and analyzing those hairs per se, then there's no need to be sort of using this image for that information. There's no reason why you can't go back. You have the specimen catalog, pull the specimen, and use higher magnification to really, really spectacularly resolve that region of the specimen. So we're going to do is hit just Control 0 just to bring everything back down to field of view. Now let's say you wanted to get a little bit more creative. You can see that there is maybe some noise that's just in the background, the areas that were never in focus. If you wanted to just give it a little bit of a cleaner look, you can go to Noise, and you could just really quickly just hit Despeckle. It's a pretty non-destructive editing tool, and now what we have done is we've smoothed things out in the background. There's other more sophisticated ways to do it, but that's by far the fastest, and it's not so bad. Now with touchscreen also, this is where the stylus is just absolutely wonderful. What we're going to do is use the Band-Aid tool here, and this is going to enable us, and you can use your surface dial as well. If you click down on your surface dial, you can actually spin it. You can adjust the size of your stylus just by turning your dial. The other thing you can do is there's two hotkeys. So these are the brackets. The right bracket around words is going to make your stylus larger. It's going to make it smaller if you use your left bracket. But in the meantime, what we can start to do is start to clean up certain areas. So we're going to, it's not the right Band-Aid tool. This is the right Band-Aid tool. We're going to start to just clean up certain areas of dust. I want to make sure it's not copying material that doesn't actually exist. And little by little, we're going to generate a much, much, much cleaner looking photograph just using this spot healing brush. And again, this is where your stylus is such a fantastic resource to you when you do macro photography, is if you have just a lot of dust on your specimen because it's rather old or just, it was collected that way. So we'll go through and just, again, we're going to clean up a lot of the big stuff. We'll even take something that's a bit more difficult, like this large specimen, and see how, you can see how it sort of pulled areas from up here, and that doesn't look particularly good. So what you can then do is use your clone tool. What we'll do is, now that we have our clone tool here, we're going to stamp this section, hit Control to stamp it. It's either one of these. Oop. Actually, it's Alt. So you use Alt on a PC to stamp it. And now what I can do is I can drag this section down, kind of the center. See where that line is? I can match it, and then I can trace the area. Then I can go back to that Band-Aid tool, and I can remove that pollen grain from being duplicated, and then I can sort of brush and shade around the exterior part, and that's how you'd go about fixing an area like that one. So stamp tool and spot healing brush tool are the best, but obviously the best place to really start is just a clean specimen. If you can get your specimens clean without having to do this, it's going to save you a lot of time, and you don't have to worry about it, so much. Okay, the other thing that can sometimes happen is because it's touchscreen, you can rotate, as I just did, the specimen here. So the fastest way really is just hit escape on your keyboard. That'll reset. Or you can go over here to the hand tool and rotate view tool, which is also R, and that'll reset your viewpoint as well. Okay, so at this point, I think we have a pretty decent demo image of how you would go about imaging something that's dark in color, and how you can use different tools to brighten. So what I'll also do is just walk people through levels. I don't like to use levels so much, but at the same time, if ever you just want to really quick try to adjust contrast, the arrow on the left hand side, as you drag that to the right towards the peak of the histogram, is going to make things much darker. And oppositely, on the right hand side, you're going to make things much brighter. So you can see that just by moving that tool, but you can see that's quite destructive. It takes areas that are very bright and washes them out. You can see down here where now we just have white areas. We have information that's totally lost. So a happy medium then is to take this middle icon here and move it slightly to the left. And that also is going to allow you to sort of brighten dark areas of this specimen, to allow you to sort of have better visual, or better basically see those details a little bit better.